Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Annexation Task Force. And we're going to begin by having members of the task force introduce themselves. So if we could start down on my right with Greg, if you would like to lead on, and identify who you represent to or what subdivision.
Good evening. My name is Greg Starnes. I live in South Cactus Heights, the northeast part of town. We are not annexed, but we've entered into a pre-annexation agreement with the City of Sioux Falls.
I'm Marshall Selberg with the Sioux Falls City Council.
And I'm Councilor Rick Kiley, representing the Southeast District of Sioux Falls.
Matt Metzger. I'm not in a particular development. I'm on a single-family house on 57th and Sycamore, just south of there.
Jeff Davis. I'm representing Prairie Meadows, currently in the WW3 annexation discussion. And
Councilor Greg Neisert was unable to get out of St. Paul on his planned schedule, so I'm not sure if he's going to arrive late or if he's going to have to watch the recording of the proceedings afterwards. And Tina Harrelson is another individual, citizen representative on the task force, who is not here this evening. How many people do we have new to the proceedings tonight? So we do have a few. Okay, well, I'm going to present pretty similar to those of you that have been to the first two meetings. You could probably recite this, my opening remarks for me already, because you've heard me state them a couple of times, but I think it's worth going through again just what our purpose is. This task force was formed to offer suggestions to the administration and City Council on how to improve the annexation process here in Sioux Falls. This task force will not address specific properties or subdivisions in and around Sioux Falls. It's never been the intention of the task force to consider specific properties or subdivisions for annexation. Once again, our goal is to improve the process and to provide guidelines that are fair and equitable for all. Furthermore, if you have an existing pre-annexation agreement, the work this task force performs will not alter your existing agreement. And I've also heard concerns and continue to hear concerns about a timeline being set for the annexation of properties and subdivisions around the city. And again, I want to assure you that there is no timeline, not 6 months, not 1 year, not any period of time, and it's not coming from any individual or individuals. Only the City Council can actually bring that process forward. We will continue to have public input at each meeting, and we ask that you hold your comments and questions until that time. And additionally, the city website, some of this information was provided for you last time, but the Sioux Falls City website, www.siouxfalls.org, will include news releases, meeting packets, recordings, because this is being recording right now, as well as live broadcast and web stream, and other contact information is available on that website too. You could submit questions through, because we will go a number of weeks before our next meeting, so if you have any questions, you could submit them to the website in the meantime. Toward the end of this process, and we're not exactly sure how long this is going to take, we'll most likely have we will have additional meetings. We have 2 more that are on the schedule, and we may add more. It's up to the task force members to make that decision. But towards the end of the process, we'd like to also have an open house process that would be less formal, where people can gather and ask their specific questions at that time too. A reminder that this task force is advisory in nature. Only the full City Council has the authority to address annexations. We will simply bring recommendations to the full City Council on how to improve the overall process of annexations. It'll be up to the City Council then to adopt its recommendations. More open discussion and public input will take place again at that time as well. So in conclusion, The goal of this task force is to identify a process that not only assists the city in the planning and the coordination of services, but it is important to identify a process that is agreeable, fair, and beneficial for all. The agenda now, and I would ask task force members this evening, let's hold questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll ask questions at that time. I know that previously we asked some questions that the presenter intended to address anyway, so if you would just wait until the end of the presentation, and then we'll have our opportunity to ask questions at that point in time. And first up on the agenda is Colleen Moran, and Colleen is going to be addressing ADA sidewalk requirements. Thank you for being here this evening, Colleen, and welcome.
Thank you. Councillor Kiley and Councillor Selberg and other task force members, thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to speak to you about the American with Disabilities Act. I am Colleen Moran. I'm one of the assistant city attorneys. And one of the things I'm tasked with is ensuring that the city is compliant with the American with Disabilities Act. I'm a certified ADA coordinator in addition to being a licensed attorney. And so I just have a few minutes and general information about the ADA and the city's obligations regarding it. As you may know, the American with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990, signed into law. And what it is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Its purpose then is to ensure that individuals with disabilities have the same opportunity as everyone else in our community. And because of that, the American with Disabilities Act and the federal government, the federal laws have looked at it and said there are certain things that municipalities need to follow in order to ensure that every community member has the same access. And I know that with annexation, one of the concerns is pathways and travel of pedestrians and, of course, sidewalks. And so that's what I will focus on tonight, just in a very short presentation, very general presentation. So under the American with Disabilities Act, the question that probably comes to mind, are sidewalks required? And the answer is, it depends. I think probably many of you, or some of you who have dealt with lawyers in the past, might think that is the answer that lawyers always give, is that it depends. And in this case, it certainly is the correct answer. It really depends on a number of circumstances whether a sidewalk or a pathway is needed. Some of those circumstances include connectivity, because as I put on the slide, connectivity is essential under the American with Disabilities Act. And what I mean by connectivity is that a person who has a disability, whether it be a wheelchair or uses a cane of travel because of a visual impairment, they need to be able to be connected from one sidewalk to the next, or a road or an intersection. All of those things need to be connected in order for persons in our community to be able to travel in our community. There are some exceptions to sidewalk design and pathways, and generally the exception is to the design, but not for the need. And if certain pathways are not present, there are things that might trigger that. For instance, if there's not a sidewalk in a development currently, I can never promise you that there would never be a need for a sidewalk, or that a sidewalk would never have to be put in, because we don't know that. I was reading case law, and one of the cases said that it's difficult for any municipality to see what the fortune or misfortune will be in the future, and that is certainly something that I think that we need to consider. Some of the things that might trigger the need for a pathway or a sidewalk to be put in to a development that currently doesn't have one is what develops around that area. For instance, if public transportation comes out into an area and we would need a bus stop requires, a pad and a waiting place, and that would then probably lead to the need for a sidewalk. If there is a neighborhood park that gets put into, the Parks Department tries to have neighborhood parks put in within a half mile of every residence in Sioux Falls. And if this area is developed and has a neighborhood park that is put into place, then that might trigger that as well. There are other things that might trigger it as far as road improvements, If there is a connecting property that makes improvements and installs sidewalks, that might then trigger it in the next property. Because we have to have that connectivity from one property to the next, so that people can travel safely. All of our pedestrians and community members can travel safely through the community, whether they have a disability or they don't have a disability. And so when you think about the ADA and its requirements, connectivity really is the key to it. I know that we can't talk specifically about any of the properties, and certainly I don't want to do that at that time, but generally that's what the law would say. And that we, as the City of Sioux Falls, want to and are required to follow the American with Disabilities Act. And we take great pride in the effort that we take and that we make to make sure that we are compliant with everything in the American with Disabilities Act, and that includes pedestrian travel. At this time, if you have questions for me, I know that's a very short overview of what is a very long and lengthy law. I would be more than willing to answer any questions that you have. Okay, they can't hear me, so I might have to start over. You don't want to hear me again, some of you?
Do we have any questions
You
from
know that
members of the
lawyers
task?
are always more than willing to speak more than once, so I would be glad to cover it again. But if you haven't heard me, I will just give you a general overview. The American with Disabilities Act requires that municipalities provide the same opportunity for individuals with disabilities as any other community member. And that includes their ability to travel through the community. That might include then the need for sidewalks or some other kind of pathway so that individuals can get from one point in the community to the next point in the community. So do any of the task force members have any questions for me at this time?
I'm good.
Councilor Selberg, go ahead.
Thank you. So I know some of these places or certain locations are saying, well, if we were annexed, maybe we don't need to have, we're happy not having sidewalks, we're happy not to just leaving things the way they are as far as expense-wise and that. Sometimes that's brought up. Obviously, this issue would probably throw a wrench in some of that depending on what develops or what happens in certain areas, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That's why we're covering that today, just saying that that ties in with that issue.
Exactly. You know, anytime you talk about annexation into the city, there are a number of things that you have to take into consideration. And why we're covering the ADA is because the connectivity and the travel for pedestrians is one of those issues. I talked about things that trigger the need for sidewalks, and one of the things that I forgot to mention is if somebody in your community or in your neighborhood develops a disability, they then might need to have a sidewalk for that purpose because they need to be able to travel within your community, within your neighborhood, even though they don't have that need right now. And so that's why we're talking about it, just so people are aware that we need to follow the American with Disabilities Act. There are times when things will trigger the need for a pathway in a community that currently doesn't have one.
So I do have a question. So you're saying that if an area is annexed and it becomes part of the city, does the ADA force a sidewalk in that area? I mean, that's my question.
Initially upon annexation,
Is it the law that if it becomes a part of the city, does it have to have a sidewalk?
there's nothing in the law that currently says that if it becomes part of the city that it has to have a sidewalk.
Okay.
However, there are some things that would trigger that, and so I can't say that every property that's not annexed, that is annexed, wouldn't have to put sidewalks in.
That answers my question.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you.
So are ADA improvements typically the result of a complaint, or are they city initiated?
Both. When we put in, for instance, if we put in a new roadway in the city, we are required at the time that we make that a restructure road, that we upgrade any of the ADA things that we haven't done in the past, which includes curb cuts and sidewalks and those types of things.
And that's within existing city limits now that you're referring to?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Are there other questions for Colleen? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Colleen.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for the brief recap as well, too. Okay, next up on our agenda is Director Mike Cooper, and Director Cooper is going to be talking about engineering design standards. Welcome again, Director Cooper.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm Mike Cooper. I'm Director of Planning and Building Services for the City of Sioux Falls. And Chad Heavey will also be a speaker tonight, joining me a little bit later. Chad is our city engineer. With my presentation tonight, I wanted to start out to the task force and to people that are participating in this tonight to maybe go back and repeat some things that we did the first meeting, because we were in the library. It was a pretty tight setting, and I'm not sure everybody was able to comprehend or hear what some of these introductory comments were about. Because I think it's important to, again, emphasize why are we having this discussion and why is this task force important to pursue this particular project or this subject. So let's go back and talk about what are the purposes of annexations. From the city's standpoint, we talk about it's a better way of coordinating services and improvements when property is in the corporate limits. It provides a greater awareness of timing and expectations for improvements. So property that is annexed or that we know is going to be annexed is aware that if there's going to be a street or utility improvement that's going to impact that property, they're aware of the timing and the impact of that particular project. Citywide, it can provide a more equitable distribution of costs for services and infrastructure. Those services can be everything from police and fire protection to a specific utility or street improvement. Future annexation areas can be planned and coordinated for both public and private improvements in an economical manner. Again, if we know ahead of time which properties are going to be in or out of the city, we have a 5-year capital improvement program that we present to the city council each year. And that's really the mechanism that we have as a city government to identify where future road improvements are going to be, where future water, sewer, other utility improvements are going to be, where we need a future fire station or a future neighborhood park. And so as we are involved with managing growth and development of the city limits, that's another reason why we want to have an idea of when properties or if properties are going to be annexed in the future, or where these urban growth areas are going to be. And then a key part of annexation is that it makes property accessible to city services, such as water, sewer, storm drainage, and those kind of things. So that's a real general discussion about why you would want to have property in the city limits. Now, we know that there's other viewpoints, and we haven't talked about them very much up until now, but as the planning staff and other city staff have gone out and met with neighborhoods, and we've already heard some feedback from the first 2 task force meetings, there are opposing viewpoints about annexation, and we want to make sure that we recognize those and understand those. The first one that we know is that residents outside the city limits chose to build there. They chose to buy those lots or a business specifically because they wanted to be outside the city, and they're not interested in being taxed for services that maybe they don't feel they want or need. We know that in many cases they're concerned about retaining their rural character, and for this reason they would not be supportive of annexation because of the concern that it's going to be even more urbanization of their particular neighborhood. There may be a desire to maintain ordinances that are different in the city limits versus out of the city limits, such as animals, and I mentioned before, open burning, fireworks. There's a lot of different ordinances that would not be applicable to property that's outside the city limits. We also know that there's interest in annexation that varies from neighborhood to neighborhood, And as we've gone out, we've actually heard differences of opinion, even within the same neighborhood, that some people are possibly interested in looking at the potential for future annexation, and others are not. So even with an existing neighborhood, we might have a difference of opinion about whether annexation is a good aspect or not. And they may have that difference of opinion for different reasons. And then finally, we know and we've heard loud and clear that a big concern is the cost of what we call urban infrastructure on particularly these large lots. So we wanted to make sure that the public knew and the task force knew that we are listening to these other viewpoints. And as we go forward with some recommendations, we want to make sure that we keep these in mind and that we are challenged to try to address as many of these as we can. But I want to come back to what are some of the implications of not having land within the city limits. And it can be different depending on different circumstances. We've discovered in the past that in some cases we've had to work around unannexed property when there's a major street improvement planned or a major utility improvement planned. We don't have a lot of cases, but in some instances, projects may have to be delayed because we're negotiating with property that's not in the city differently than property that is in the city limits. When we do a street widening, we typically want to get more right-of-way. We typically want to look at where those access points are. And if the property is not in the city limits, it makes that a lot more challenging. As I've said before, local municipal codes, building codes are different in many cases with property in the city versus property not in the city. If property is not annexed or if property is next to agricultural land, we can see that in some cases there's conflicts that might be from noise, traffic, whatever it might be. And we've heard from we've heard from both sides, where we've heard from rural residents that are concerned about urban development around them and the negative impacts that they might perceive. On the other hand, if we're coming up against an area that's not in the city, again, we have those potential land use conflicts that people might get involved with. And then just when city boundaries are not contiguous, in some cases it can create confusion about who's providing services, and we certainly don't want to end up with duplication of service providers. One of the citizens that I recently responded to that was concerned about this whole discussion of annexation and why we're doing it. And I was trying to summarize from the planning departments, from the city staff, as well as the task force. Again, why are we talking about this subject? And I'm going to summarize my comments that we're very aware of the fact that people have chosen to live outside the city limits in a rural setting. We know why they've done that historically. We get it because they're looking for a different level of services than city residents would typically be looking for. But one of our main goals for the task force is to give people a greater awareness and understanding of what is going to happen as the Sioux Falls city limits continues to expand outward, because we are going to keep growing. The map that I showed that first meeting with the history of how the city limits have grown, we're now about 80 square miles in size, and we're projecting what the city limits will potentially look like over the next 25 to 30 years. So we want to have better answers to residents and property owners who may eventually or who are now surrounded by the city limits. What's going to happen to your development? What's going to happen to your property? If you're looking at buying, if you're looking at selling, we want to have better answers to give to the public about what the impact is going to be going forward for these properties that are not in the city or that will potentially be surrounded by the city limits. So, two big things that we went through last time were the financial impacts of annexation. And one of the big ones was the impact on personal property taxes or real estate property taxes. And what we said is that there's a range depending on the township, depending on the county, depending on the school district that you're in. But when you're annexed, your property taxes could go up somewhere between 22 and 30%. We also talked about these other potential fees, street maintenance fee for every foot of frontage, and then stormwater drainage fees. And again, we know that that's a concern to many people about the property tax impact. So one of the things that we're hoping we can do as a task force is to look into, are there ways that we can legally, with either our home rule charter or under state law, look at ways of addressing the property tax impacts, particularly for people that are elderly, disabled, or that have lower incomes. We have researched, there are some existing programs available through the state of South Dakota. There are some pretty significant income guidelines, but the one that I've got bold up there is called the Property Tax Reduction from Municipal Taxes for the Elderly and Disabled. And so we're looking into that in more detail, and we're going to try to provide the task force some more direction for that as we go into our future meetings. But the point is, we've heard from the public that 25% bump in property taxes is a concern, and are there ways that we can address that somehow going forward? The other thing that we talked about last time was with special assessments, particularly for streets and what the cost of those were. And then we got into this discussion about benefits of being in or out of the city. And I've heard from a number of people questioning what that term benefits really is and how you define it, how you measure it. So we thought we would put a dollar bill up on the screen, and maybe instead of using the word benefits, use the word services, because when we all pay property taxes, those taxes go to provide a variety of services. And those services might be provided by the city, they might be provided by a township, they might be provided by a school district. And not everybody that's paying for those services is necessarily going to use all of them, but they're still paying for them. This is a breakdown of every dollar of city property taxes. How does it get spent, and what are those services that people have access to? So almost 50 cents of every city tax dollar is designated for police and fire protection, public safety. Now, does everybody call the fire department every year? Does everybody utilize the police department every year? No. But we still, as a city, have to help pay for that service. The same with highways and streets, and you can go down the list. So the point that I was trying to get across is, let's not talk about benefits, but let's talk about services. And let's recognize, yes, we pay for services that we may not use, that we may not even feel that benefit us. But that's the way all these local governments are structured, whether it's a school district. If I don't have kids in my school district, I'm still paying my school district taxes. If there's county services that I don't use, I'm still paying my county taxes. So we just thought it was important to have that discussion and explanation. All right, now I'm finally getting to the subject, so Chad, if you want to start creeping up here with me. In addition to the property tax, the other big concern that we heard from last week or last meeting was the cost of roads and infrastructure. And so Chad and I want to go through tonight a discussion about engineering design standards and then some different options that the task force can think about going forward besides the traditional typical city urban section road. Engineering design standards are put together as a way of maintaining consistency throughout the municipality for different types of services pertaining to roads and utilities primarily. These standards ensure a health and safety environment. They've been established, as I said, for roads, utilities, lighting, and sidewalks throughout the city. And these standards are adopted by City Council resolution, and so they can be amended by City Council resolution. We saw last time what the typical cost estimate is for a urban section residential street. This slide shows about $226 per foot per side. And so realistically, for these acreages, if they have 100 feet of frontage or 150 feet of frontage, imagine having to pay $200 and some per foot to put in an urban section street. How realistic is that to expect people to want to do that, irregardless of having to make them do that? And this does include the utilities as well. The other option, that we talk about is what we call the rural section. This should just say rural section roadway. So here's a picture of more of our typical rural residential areas with an asphalt road with the side ditches, no sidewalk, no curb and gutter. This one does happen to show street lights. But the typical cost for this is about $62.50 per foot per side. But remember that this does not include water and sewer. This is just for the street itself. So as we're talking about options for future rural developments that might be annexed, because in some cases rural residences may want city services, particularly water or sewer. Historically, those rural developments that have been coming into the city, that's probably been the major motivation, is to get hooked up to the city water or city sewer system. So the engineering design standards do have those options, and now I'm going to turn it over to Chad to talk about the options for rural section roads and also the different options for water and sanitary sewer.
Thank you, Mike. Chad Heavey with the Engineering Division. I'm just going to maybe back up a slide. Oh, maybe I'm... All right, I'm not going to then. So what we're going to focus on, just what we talked about, was this last picture of a urban roadway with just basically the road and no curb and gutter. And so we do have engineering design standards. If somebody wanted to come in, propose to build a rural subdivision, and it was approved, we do have some design standards. One of them being that the roadways would be hard surfaced, as well as the driveways. If the roads were going to be public roads maintained by the city, we would have a right-of-way requirement, a minimum of 60 feet that we would want for the roadway, and that's where the utilities would be. If the road was going to be private, and we'll get to this in a little bit, we would have a minimum width of an access easement that would serve as the roadway. We have a minimum street width. We would want a certain section, 4 inches of asphalt on 6 inches of gravel. We would want a certain slope in the ditch so they could be mowed and maintained properly. We could require additional lanes, per se, if the traffic volumes were high enough. And again, naming of the streets and the different types of signs, whether it be stop signs or speed signs or yield signs, would be approved by the city. So again, those are for a rural subdivision where you would not have any curb and gutter. This would just basically be the asphalt section. Now, I did mention public and private streets. The majority of streets in Sioux Falls are public, but there are some private. The public streets are maintained by the City of Sioux Falls. And again, they're separated. You have the separate lots, but then you also have platted right-of-way. And that right-of-way is where the streets are, the sidewalk is, and where the utilities are. And we have minimum standards for those. The public streets, Mike mentioned the $1 per front foot street maintenance fee. That money is collected, and that's the money that is used. Part of that money is used for any future street maintenance on that roadway. So it could be a pothole patch, it could be potholes, it could be slurry seal, it could be a mill and overlay, it could be all the way to a total reconstruction. But those costs are all paid for by the city. So once the initial road is in, you'll never be assessed for improvements again. Again, most common is the public streets. We do have private streets. They are maintained by the people that live on that street. Usually there's not this right-of-way. Usually there is a easement, and that easement is usually where the water and sewer is if they choose to have public utilities. Most of the private streets in town have public utilities that are maintained by the city. So thus we have that easement that allows us to go onto the street to make any improvements and clean manholes and things like that. The private streets, there are, the standards are less. The setbacks are different as you construct homes on those private streets. But any of the maintenance, any of the road construction, anything like that is borne by the property owners of that road. And usually, whether it's a homeowners association, but those are the ones that are responsible for all maintenance of the road, from snow to repaving. So those are the two differences in the different types of streets we have in the city. And finally, we'll just talk a little bit about utilities. And we have minimum sewer lines, and they are sized accordingly so they can carry the wastewater. Typically, they're deeper than the water lines. That's one. It comes into the basement, so of course that's going to be deeper than the water line. We do have manholes, a maximum every 400 feet, and that is just for cleaning the sewer system. There is a city ordinance that requires a property to connect to the city sewer line. If it is within 200 feet of the city sewer, you are given then a notice to connect within 5 years. However, we've run into this, in past discussions on annexations. The property owner just spent several $1,000s on a new septic system. And, I get it. It's going to function for many, many years, and we have, made the commitment that we would allow you to stay on that septic system until a point where the system wasn't working. We had one recently where, the tank collapsed, and, they didn't have an option other than to spend several $1,000s on a new septic system. So, if people have done that, we understand, and as long as that septic system is functioned properly, we would allow them, or could allow them. So if and how this pertains to the city ordinance is if the system is beginning to fail, then is the time that we would put you on notice that the sewer lines within 200 feet, you have 5 years to connect. So that's how we would handle that. Water requirements. On our short cul-de-sacs, we have a minimum 6-inch water line. A lot of the other local streets have 8-inch. And all of that is calculated based on that we have enough flow coming out of a fire hydrant to fight a fire and meet all the demands of a fire and anything else that could be going on. Their minimum is 6 feet underground, just so nothing freezes. We do have hydrant spacing requirements. Another city ordinance talks about the notice to connect within 2 years of annexation, or it could be something different through some type of an agreement that is worked out. We do have customers of the City of Sioux Falls water system that are not in the city limits, and it is more expensive, about 2.5 times more expensive for that water, but there is some customers that live outside the city limits. That's it for me. So can I answer any questions?
Before we take questions, I just want to again summarize. We threw a lot of information again at you tonight, which is what we do. But really the purpose of this is to get back to the goal of the task force, developing recommendations on how to address the growth of the city and what to do with these areas that are not in the city that are going to eventually be impacted by the city. And so we wanted to make sure that the task force knew and the public knew that there are options for us to consider as we look at what these final recommendations or guidelines might be or requirements might be. So with that,
Okay.
we can do it now, or we can do questions later on as well.
Sure. Before we go into task force discussion, do members of the task force have questions for Mr. Cooper or for Mr. Heavey? Yes, Councilor Selber.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Cooper, so obviously a big concern on this, on annexation is the cost. And I think you just talked about it among many things, like if things can be tied into these 5-year capital improvement programs, wouldn't that save some pretty substantial dollars from the get-go, which should subsequently lower these numbers, these massive numbers that some people are looking at or have looked at, and assessments, these type of things, if this can all be worked in?
Right.
I'm sure you've done some of that already. I'm not saying it's a new idea, but I mean, that's a big part of this.
Sure, and then as we go forward, we recognize too that there's not one size fits all, but if we have the guidelines or at least what type of standards the neighborhood should be expecting, then we can sit down and work through a neighborhood, whether it's a pre-annexation agreement or whatever it might be, and we can give them a better idea, as I said, of what the timing and requirements might be in the future. So again, right now when people ask us what's going to happen to our subdivision in the future, I don't think a very good answer is we don't know. And so that's what we're trying to do, is give a better answer. But yeah, there's in terms of future capital planning or infrastructure, it just provides a better way of managing how that could be done in the future.
And are you able to, like, would you be able to break it down for somebody if they said, well, if we did this in 5 years versus if we were tied into this next 5-year plan, what would it cost versus if we did it then? Or,
sure,
or is
yeah,
that
we can do that.
Too wide a range of a...
Right. Which is what, and we can do that, yes, and we will do that, which is why, you know, when we started out with this map of 60-some properties, that was never intended to say that they're all going to be in the city within the next year or 5 years. The city growth is divided into 5-year increments or 5-year tiers, and so that's how it would be timed, okay, if they are going to be coming in. So yeah, you can plan ahead in those 5-year increments.
Excuse me, I do have one question.
Sure.
Maybe you can answer this. Charges for goods and services, would that cover, are the utilities in that percentage of the income for the city? Revenue generated for the city? In other words, 26% of the money for total revenue coming to the city is for goods and services. And I'm asking would they be utilities be in that?
Okay, what are you looking at? I'm not sure what you're looking at there.
I'm looking at your budget for 2017.
The dollar bill?
No, I'm looking at a copy out of the city's
Oh, I'm
budget for
sorry.
2017. And it cuts it up in a pie, and 26% is goods and services, 44% of the revenue comes from taxes, bond proceeds, et cetera. Are the utilities operated as a profit center?
Yeah, they're enterprise funds, yes. So they're operated independently of the property tax.
Okay.
So water, sewer, sanitary, all that, those are enterprise funds.
They're in the goods and services or in the taxes?
Tracy, help me. Where are you at? We have our finance director.
There we go.
Because I don't have
That's
that
what we
chart in
like,
front of me.
money guy.
Thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah,
Do you understand the question?
I'll take a stab at it. Tracy Turback with the City Finance Office.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you're looking at the graphic that it sounds like you're looking at, it would be a kind of a pie chart of the entire city budget that includes revenues from all sources, including, as Mike described, our enterprise funds, water and sewer. So that slice of the pie chart that is identified as charges for goods and services would in fact include water and sewer revenues that are generated for those services. It might also include, well, it would also include things like our public health department that charges for services,
okay,
or the parks department that has fees for some of their services. So it would all be combined in there, but that water and sewer fees would be part of that.
Okay. When you design those budgets, are they designed to, in other words, for goods and services where there's a possibility, does the revenue from that flow over into any other areas of the city's revenue? In other words, does it make $1,000 more than it takes in?
What we identify as enterprise funds would be our water department, our sewer department. The city operates the landfill, the public parking system, and our electric. We've got a small electric utility. All of those are enterprise funds, and to us that means that they are intended to be self-supporting. So the rates for those services are set at a level that will generate enough revenue to pay all the day-to-day operating expenses, all the capital investment in the infrastructure to provide those services, and service any debt that those enterprises might have. But they don't provide any profits over and above that to the general city government. So it's really intended to be a break-even operation, and rates are set in that fashion.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Matt, I believe, go ahead.
I got a question for you on this. The dollar bill for the property tax usage budget. Do you know off the top of your head, for every dollar of sales tax, how that gets allocated? Does some of that go to street improvements?
Okay, the city collects 2 pennies of sales tax. The first penny is used for the city operating budget. The second penny is used for capital. So the penny that's used for the operating, it might mirror this breakdown, but the penny that's for capital projects is all for infrastructure, roads, fire stations, those kind of things.
Any other questions? Okay.
Whoops, I have one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
For Chad. When you were talking about your design standards, I'm just thinking here, like a Split Rock Heights development that's not in the city right now, and they've got their streets and stuff in. How do those streets compare to, is there width up to par? Is there thickness up to par?
You know, I don't know exactly the right answer, but I would think that they probably are that section of 4 inches of asphalt over 6 inches of gravel.
They don't have the curb and gutter, but
they don't have the curb and gutter, but I would think that they're they have to have some type of a section of road. I don't know if they have 3 inches of asphalt or 4, but, you know, 2 inches of asphalt just isn't going to last, because they still have garbage trucks and things like that have to drive on those streets. So I'm guessing that they're probably at least 3 to 4 inches of asphalt. I would guess that they're probably 22 to 24 feet wide. So if you're driving a pickup and you meet a garbage truck, I mean, you tend to move over to the outside edge of the road, and so I think that they're probably close to what our requirements would be.
If I could just follow up on, again, we're not talking about specifics, but as Chad went through, there is this additional option of private streets. So a particular neighborhood that either has or could form an association, and they would just tax themselves to maintain their local roads. So that is another option.
Okay. I'm confused, because what I've been hearing from Split Rock for the last couple meetings is they've got they've got the streets and everything else. So what is it that they truly gain if they, in other words, if they, no, wait a minute, hang on a second. In fairness to you and the city, it's a valid question. You obviously think there's something to gain, but I guess what I'm saying to them, the arguments, I've heard so many arguments on annexation in the last 3 years that my ears are sore, but what do they truly gain if they've already got, because it was my understanding that the city abandoned the idea of the private street without the sidewalk and all that kind of stuff. I need a clarification on that for sure, but I guess I'll go back to my question. How do you take a nice area like Split Rock or wherever that's got that, because we're not talking about specific areas, we're talking hypothetically that's already got that. What is it, give me a prime motivator for them to pay 22 to 30% more real estate tax and not receive a thing?
Well, so every situation is different, but let me start by saying that we wanted to make sure that people knew that if these properties do become part of the city, that there's the potential that they could maintain their rural character, right? We wanted to make sure that people knew that that was an option, whether they're going to be public rural section roads or private rural section roads.
So it is an option now, still today?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Now, then we get into the discussion later on about, and again, I was going to avoid the word benefit, but you brought it up again.
Sorry.
So if people want to be annexed, typically they're looking for something that they don't have.
Correct.
And historically that has been, as I said, water and sewer. Municipal water, municipal sewer. Now, if you're getting me all choked up now, so.
Sorry, Mike.
So, yes, if there are neighborhoods that believe they have all the services, the level of services that they want and they need, then that's one of the challenges of the task force is what do we tell them as the city continues to grow? And so that, we're not going to have a specific answer for that tonight, but that is some things that we want to talk about is because these neighborhoods are not going to go away.
No, they're not, and
Right.
there's a dual hazard here. If you happen to live in a neighborhood between here and Brandon keeps growing, one or the other of the cities is going to get you. It may be the more unfriendly one that gets you, whichever one that might be. I'm not saying which one it is or otherwise because I don't know. But I mean, I understand that,
Yep.
you can't.
Yeah, so it gets back to the point, do we ignore them? Do we have a plan? Do we have some guidelines that we can tell them of what may or may not happen? That's what we're trying to work through this process.
Okay.
So we're not going to have all those specific answers tonight to show everybody, but we hope that we will by the time that we're done.
I think we will.
Thank you, Director Cooper. We're at the task force member discussion point of the agenda, and if I may just share some thoughts with the task force that I have had for a number of weeks now, and we are now at the appropriate time to express those. Following our meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had a long discussion with one of our city council staff members about the subdivisions and the benefits of living in some of the areas that I'm familiar with, and I'm going to use Split Rock has already been mentioned, and I have friends that live there, so I'm probably most familiar with that particular subdivision. I think it's an absolute beautiful subdivision. I think it brings a lot of benefits to the individuals that live there, as well as to the community for people that maybe want to move to Sioux Falls, or at least in close proximity of the city of Sioux Falls. They may not move unless they can find that nice rural setting that exists in that particular subdivision now. And so I think I see a lot of benefits to that. And just to make it very clear, I do believe that, for this counselor anyway, I do believe that we need to find some common ground here. And the information that was presented 3 weeks ago with sidewalks and curb and gutter and streets up to city standards, that's probably a worst case scenario in how the amount that would be assessed to that particular property owner. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the direction that we have to go. This task force can bring forward recommendations, and we can decide, what is the process, and should we have different standards other than what exists inside city limits currently? Is it possible to bring in a subdivision exactly as it is, providing that we don't have issues with sanitary sewer, we don't have issues with drainage and things of that nature? But again, I think that's the direction that I'm going in terms of trying to find some common ground, and to be fair, because I try to put myself in the position that my friends are in, living in these subdivisions. And they moved out there, and quite frankly, I was born and raised in this city. And at that time, I was on just about 37th and Prairie, which was south of Augustana University. That was the edge of the city then. I had cornfields all around me. There was a farm right up on the hill. And when I went to South Sioux Elementary, I crossed a county road. I went through the ditch, up over the road, and went through the ditch to my kindergarten classes. Never did I believe that the city would expand in the 4 directions that it has today. I mean, in a way, though, that's the signs of a good, healthy, vibrant community. So we have to find a way, as the city begins to encroach on these other communities that were separate, and now they're basically being engulfed by the city, we need to find a way to work together. And so with having said that, I'd like to open it up to the rest of the task force members for their comments and thoughts.
I've got there's I think there's a way to begin this. I think part of the thing that I've run into myself and in our neighborhood, and some of the other people run into, there's some real simple things that we could start with, and one of them is, and I'm going to go clear down to the mail. If it's worth mailing a resident something certified, then it should be worth a return receipt so they know they got it. And if they can't do it, then don't waste the money on sending it certified. What happens is you get, you're automatically, the guy for some reason doesn't get it, doesn't realize it, whatever, and then all of a sudden here it is. Oh God, and then everybody's mad. You get off on the wrong foot. And the first thing they say is, well, the city tried to slide that one by me, Nobody's trying to slide anything by anybody, but if you're going to waste the money on certified mail, get a return receipt with a signature and have a checkoff list of those that it was mailed to them for a reason, and record the fact that they did get the mail. That would be one in the very beginning of the process, And I agree with you that I love Sioux Falls, and the only thing that I think we have going right now is we've developed almost an insatiable desire to grow and grow in a hurry, you know, and match the growth with the aesthetic appeal and all the things we have. And I don't disagree with that, the growth, but I think we need to maybe take a deep breath and see what we've done to some of these subdivisions or rural developments, for the lack of a better term. I think we need to have a qualified independent panel that's not related to that doesn't work for the city, that reviews the areas around these developments to see what impact our insatiable desire to grow has done as we've surrounded them, and whether the projects have been finished, and whether it had an impact on water flow, or whether it had an impact on the street condition, was there a traffic study done, things like that. These are things, and I'm trying very, very hard not to just be biased of my own neighborhood, but I can tell you that in the future I'll get Mike and some of these guys to ride around with me, and I'll show you why we have too much water flow in Prairie Meadows, and that we're not freeloaders of the sewer system, that we've been freeloaded upon, and by some unfortunate incidents that happened in the past. So, but I think we need to have, and you guys are experts at putting people that know what they're doing together, that are unbiased. They're not Democrats, they're not Republicans, they're retired contractors, they're attorneys, some type of a panel, a group, to review an area that says, well, oh, we built around these guys, it has a negative impact on the cost of their annexation and the cost of their assessment, and we should credit that much, and the city absorbs that in some way. Growth costs money. And so I think that needs to happen prior to any decisions being made or piling on service fees for this and that because something happened in the past. So, and I just think that would be a fair way to do it, and it would keep the council out of hot water, and I think the mayor's a fair man, and that he would go, if you had people that were qualified to go out and make those determinations, that it would be helpful and it would be supportive to your cause when you presented that annexation to that particular development. Things like the water buyback. I'm a business guy. There's a lot of business people in this room. If I buy somebody's business and I absorb, it's not my response. It's not the resident's responsibility to pay $2,000 to the water that we've been paying the water bill to for 20 years. So you can change it to the city. That's water, that utility. Put that in your budget. Don't put it in the assessment. You know, I think that's a mistake, and I think that's what gets people riled up. Stuff like that. So I think if we consider those things, and we take a more reasonable approach, a business-like approach to a lot of this stuff, interest rates and things like that, I think you can be very successful in getting to 60 locations into the city to where we can grow and not grow through and grow over. You know, if you grow over these areas, it's kind of like a cyst. Sooner or later it'll stick out and it'll be painful and it'll be a problem, and there's no question about that. So I think if there's some way that we can engage the people to where they are proud to be coming in the city, you know, and I think you touched on it really very nicely about Split Rock. If it that development to keep its aesthetic appeal and the way and the neighborhood it is, I think is a fair request, and I appreciate that you took that position. I just think there's a lot of little things that we try to. I don't think the city can afford to be a bully in an annexation thing, and I think in a lot of cases they have been a bully. And not in any one person. You're not a bully. Heck, I like you. We've talked 1,000 times. But I think that strategically, sometimes we can say, well, if we do this and we do that, they'll have to do this. It's not a chess game. It's an annexation. So I think we need to stop playing chess, accept the fact as a city, we don't mind investing in things. We buy in the railroad yard downtown. We invest in parks and houses. If you're going to invest in bringing these small areas of people that have paid the sales tax for their services for 25 years and haven't received any services. They're not complaining about that. So I think that some of that needs to go into the budget, and I think that the mayor is fair. I think we have a good city council. We live in an outstanding city, and we just need to act like it when we go into and not bully our way into annexation. Thank you.
Thank you.
As someone who's been annexed, my major concern about it was that everyone's treated like they're a developer. And everyone's treated as though you're on this land, it's going to develop because we foresee this, and therefore you need these benefits. And that is a lot different approach than if you just want to be left alone to live in your home, because you're not developing. So to do all these, pay all these costs, it does not provide any benefit, tangible benefit to me. Now, I understand the law enforcement. I understand some of those things. But, you know, I would not go out and build a 5-lane street in front of my property for my benefit. So in some of these things, it's to the city's and the general public's benefit to have a major street in that location. I think then if they want it that bad, the public ought to be invested in paying for it and not the individual. It's a completely different situation when you are asking to be brought in because it benefits you and you want to develop your property. That's completely different because you foresee that you're going to develop this, make money off of it, and you can afford to pay to have some of these amenities that's going to help succeed with your project. It's not the same when it's an individual.
There has to be some kind of a mathematical formula that can, based on square footage or something like that, where somebody that has a large lot, because here's what happens, here's what I'm hearing, and for your benefit and for the council's benefit, here's what I hear. They develop, or they do the improvements on 41st Street out from the T. Ellis Road back to Sertoma. Okay, the residents, the Prairie Meadows residents on the front, they're going to get their assessment is less than a third of what the rest of ours are, and of course that automatic, and they know it to begin with, so that automatically bought the vote of them because it's some type of a busy street credit that they get. Is that the way that works? Yeah. Okay. So you bought the vote of that 14 homes. For a guy like myself that's a hermit on 42nd Street, that's going to pay $364 a linear foot, that's not a happy place. And I'm not complaining about myself. I'm talking about the fairness. There needs to be, on the other hand, a person that has a corner lot deserves a break on the frontage. If he has a corner lot, maybe that number is 1.5 times. In other words, is lot 60 by 100. So he gets the credit on 60. If maybe his property is 60 by 500, well, he should get a discount on the 60 by 100, the 100 side. But on the other side, it could either be because it'll eventually be plotted eventually. That assessment can become an account receivable to the city in your city balance sheet and this and that. And I'm sorry. How'd that be turned? So I mean, there's a lot of considerations here mathematically, and that create fairness without, because what happens is if you don't do it that way, where that becomes a balance sheet item for the city. Basically, you're taking my cost for I keep citing Prairie Meadows. I'm for everybody, but I know the cost of that one. That's $4 million. Okay, so you take $4 million. You take the discounts for this and that, and you still have a $4 million box there. We've had this discussion, and you divide the balance back and start by the linear foot to the people that don't have a discount because you just have 100 linear feet, and away you go. And the fact of the matter is, discounts are discounts, and the city can hang on to that and file cost recovery or some mathematical method to make it more fair to where, it's the 22% increase in real estate tax is fairly livable, but when you tie another $229 or $226 a linear foot, that for 20 years, that's kind of getting over the top, you know.
Any other thoughts from other members?
Well, I would say this is really why I think it's fantastic that we've got these members on the task force that are living through this or have been through the process. I mean, the input, just hearing this, I mean, I can't add a lot to that. That's all very good stuff. I think the main thing that I keep trying to look at is getting away from some of these terms where we've made it, you know, we hear the word bullying, we hear forced, we hear people are freeloaders. I mean, that's obviously, you get on that kind of conversation with this and it gets things a little tense as it is in some ways. And what we're trying to find, again, are the terms more like find common ground. What's fair? Let's use some common sense here. I agree with Mr. Davis. I mean, first of all, if we're going to send out some correspondence, I think it only makes sense. Let's make sure we're making sure the people we send it to received it, you know, things like this. But again, I won't go on too much more because these points were hit on were fantastic. My point is it's great you guys are involved and you can speak from experience, and we are trying to use all this input as best we can, and again, find some common ground and do what's fair. People don't want to get bills for things and then think don't know what it's all about. So.
The one thing I want to make clear, though, is that I think we have an excellent city government, and I think we have an excellent city and county and state. I've lived in 4 different states and 20 different cities in my lifetime, and I moved out here in 1978 and never went back to any of them. This is the best place in the country to live. I don't think any of these things that we're up against today should be a very big obstacle for the city of Sioux Falls. Not with the mayor we have, not with the council we have, not with the engineering people we have. I've met with every one of you guys. We've been talking for 3 years, and I don't see that this should become the problem that it's becoming. And I don't want to cast a shadow that this is nothing personal. I just think that sometimes we get so mechanical in the way we do things that we can't see outside the box. Sure. You know, and I want to say thanks for putting this together and letting us voice in behalf of the Split Rocks and the Prairie Meadows and the other 58 places. And I just think we need to really take some of these things to heart and go forward.
Well, and I think it's important that we have identified that we're willing to look at options, and the fact that we're looking at even public street or private streets versus public streets, giving some of the subdivisions the option of maintaining their own streets if that is what they so desire. The septic tank issue. I have a brother that I won't tell you where he lives. It's not inside city limits. It's at a lake community north of here. But they were required to go on to a sanitary sewer district just after they had installed a new septic tank. And that just, to me, just does not that's not common sense. And so and I just wanted to address in the sanitary sewer, the slide that addressed sanitary sewer and water, there was the notice to connect within 5 years when property line is within 200 feet of the line. That is even up to debate as well, too. Number one, ordinances can be amended. And number two, through agreements too, prior to that, you can reach agreements to continue to use your septic tank throughout its normal lifetime before you would hook up, if the sewer is even there to hook up to. So there are a lot of options out there, and we're willing to look at those as well. So I think I know that Attorney Danny Brown had wanted to do some follow-up with questions from the past. If we may move to that, do I have the permission of the task force members to move on? Okay, Danny, if you'd like to come up. Good discussion, by the way, everybody. Thank you.
Good evening, Danny Brown, Assistant City Attorney. I was just going to mention real quick, respond to a couple questions that were asked last time that I was able to get some answers to. And maybe they're not important at this point, but one of the questions was with respect to assessments and interest being charged on assessments over a period of time. Remember, I discussed the city ordinance that allows to put it out 20 years, 20-year payments, 5%. I was asked whether we could, as a city, change that ordinance to put it to 0 interest. We could. We would just have to amend the ordinance, so we could do that. I was also asked with respect to that, when we have been given estimates about assessment costs, was the cost of finance put into that estimate. The cost of finance was not considered in any assessment estimate that we put out there, so that wasn't in there. Then the third thing I was just going to touch on quickly was, Mr. Davis, you indicated the buyback rural water agreements or compensation that the city has to do. It's the city's policy at this point to pay that ourselves. The city does, and typically we don't look for the citizen or the person being annexed to pay that buyback. The city pays it. There's very few exceptions to that, but our general policy is the city pays for the buyback. Those were just the three things I was going to touch on quickly. I'd answer follow-up questions if you had them, but if not, that's what I had.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Danny. Well, that brings us to the, before we get to public input, because we might be losing a few people, I just want to give you the dates of the next meetings that are on the schedule. Wednesday, June 14th is our next scheduled Annexation Task Force meeting. And then Monday, July 10th. Those are the two that we have on the schedule at this point. And as I mentioned, if the July 10th happened to be the last meeting, then we foresee the possibility of doing an open house or two in different areas of the community. It's all dependent on task force input. So open it up to, and we're at 12 minutes to 7, and I know that we had 7 o'clock slated as our ending time, and I don't want to discourage people from coming forward and addressing the task force if they so want. I had hoped that we would be done with our portion of the agenda by at least 6:35, so I would be willing to extend it if necessary, but I'm not certain that we want to go a full hour over as we did the previous time, out of respect for our task force members, and I do know that some of our staff members have another function that we scheduled this meeting over the top of, so if they can get to that as well. But anyway, at this point in time, I'd welcome public input. If you could just identify yourself and...
Will do. Gary Hyatt. I live in North Cactus Heights Association. First of all, excellent meeting. I think tonight's discussion has been some of the best and some of the best information we've had. And I might be the only one here that is concerned about this, but if your area is surrounded by the city limits, and you've lived there, you know, I've been in Sioux Falls 43 years. You talked about how long you've been in Sioux Falls, and this is my town. But for 31 of those years, I've lived in North Cactus Heights, and it bugs the heck out of me that I can't vote. And I know what the answer is. Oh, come on in the city, you know, and you can do all the damn voting you want. But I think if you're surrounded by the city limits, you should be able to have a voice, because you work in the city, you spend all your money in the city, and you're surrounded by the city. And I would suggest you take that as a recommendation to the city council to consider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Anybody else have anything that they'd like to say? Yes, come forward.
Hi there. Brian Downs. I live in the Pine Lake Hills, kind of out towards 6 Mile Road. We're doing our best to stay off your radar. I think the city is missing a metric that you might want to consider adding to the annexation costs. And I know it probably relates to what a lot of people are worried about, which is the runaway cost of all the improvements and how quickly you can, if you have a corner lot or a large lot, it can, you know, basically become so much of a burden, it's no longer worth having a house there. So one of the metrics I was thinking of, you might want to consider it, is a cap based on the percentage of the homes and properties value. Because if you're looking at, let's say, a 5%, when you hit that 5% limit, the city absorbs the rest of the cost. That does two things. One, it makes it fair for the homeowners because they're going to hit this maximum and they will not be financially burdened with $40,000 on a $130,000 home. And if you went to a bank and said, hey, I want to, take out this $40,000 loan, no bank in their right mind would do it. The other thing it does is it makes the city reconsider how much they want to do and how much they really want to annex that property, because the financial burden is then put on the city for all the extra that the homeowner is not able to absorb. So I think it slows the city down, knowing that, well, we'll have to actually pay for some of that. We can't just burden the citizen with it. So I'd rather offer a solution than just a complaint. So that would be something that I would say is worth considering, is adding to those, kind of ways to arbitrate, and maybe something that can be written into the code so that citizens have a finite idea of what they would be expected to pay in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to address the task force? Yes, sir.
My name is Mike Weirach. I live in the Prairie Meadows area. My whole family has a history of growing up in that area. I've lived in all 50 states. I've been in 17 countries. This is where I came back to. So that's a hats off to this community. Like Jeff said, I think we got a great city council. The one thing that I noticed going through the annexation processes and stuff is that they say it could cost you this much. But yeah, once you say, okay, it could cost you that much, there is no limit at what they can actually charge. And as we've kind of seen in the city's past, that there's been that historical of, okay, we can do it for this, but it's going to cost us more now, so we need to pay it. And that's being put on us as the citizen. So I think there needs to be, if we're going to ask you in, here's what we're saying the cost is, that's what it is, and to put that limit on it. The other thing is, when I built my house, I lived at the end of the road. Now I live on a corner lot because the city built right next to me. And so I'm like, why should I be burdened with that extra cost when I didn't have a corner lot? The city made me a corner lot. The other thing is I live within 200 feet of the sewer line. I've never been given notice to connect to that sewer. And my house has been there for 8 years. The city's been there for longer, as just a short time, lot less than that. So,
okay,
that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mike.
And I think that's one of the things where if you had the group assess the surrounding area to see what the impact was prior, the build up to that, it's, I think if you ask the three people that live on the east side of Klein Avenue between 42nd and 41st, that the activity there, the past activity has devastated their property. Mm-hmm. Devastated it.
Yeah. And I think it was mentioned, I know this is public input, but it's been brought up twice now about the corner properties, and I believe we had mentioned actually the last meeting that it would, in terms of assessments, it's generally one side. Is that correct, Mr. Cooper? Or Danny? Or Chad? Or Tracy, if you'd like to.
Were you asking about the street maintenance fee?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
it's on the corner lots. It's just one of the sides.
One side.
Yep.
And did I hear that it was generally the shorter of the two, or am I just dreaming that, or is that part of my solution?
I would say it's typically the address side.
Yes.
So I mean, I live on a dual frontage lot, and it's off the front.
So for Mike's case here, since he was at the end of the street originally, and now because of growth around him, he's on a corner, the address side, I'm assuming that was your original street. Okay, very good. Fair enough. Thank you.
Yes.
Back to public input. There was a brief time out there. Anyone else like to address the task force? Well, okay, yes. We've got a gentleman coming here.
Excuse me. I'm Paul Klein. Live in Split Rock Heights. My problem is there are many of us in Split Rock Heights that live on a Social Security check. And there are many people with families that go to school then we're all on a limited budget. Now, I was told if we're annexed, my taxes will go up $800. Now, that money isn't going to fall out of the sky. It's going to have to come from someplace. And when I say I don't have it, I can't pay it, the city is going to put a lien on my property, and they're going to take it away and run me out of my neighborhood. Now, that is the bottom line. That stinks. It's not fair. There should be something for people who don't have the money to pay it to still stay in their homes. And the city of Sioux Falls doesn't give one damn about those people. All they care about is the bottom line of getting their money, and they don't care how they get it. And something should be done about that.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Cooper did address that, some different avenues that would be available, because I can state with certainty that that is not the direction that this task force would want to go or intends to go. And I would also wager that I don't believe that our current city council would as well. Yes, sir, over here. Paul, thank you for your comments.
Jeff Kirkleet, Split Rock Heights. The one thing that Mike was bringing up about fire protection and sheriff protection, the people that live in the county pay for that already, correct? We're not. I talked to, well, there's a joint jurisdiction agreement between the city of Sioux Falls and all the local communities, whether it be annexed or not annexed, as far as fire protection, correct? Mike? And then police protection, I talked to a local police, and they said that they have a good working relationship with the sheriff's department, but they do not have to go to a county call. So we are paying for what we're getting. That was back to, you know, I think you kind of hit on what the city, you know, what we pay for or what the city money goes to, but not that. The other thing, did a little research, and I think Joe Batchelor brought this up too, is, you know, just walking in here, looking at the infrastructure of all the salt that gets on for the ramp, for the, there's a lot of infrastructure in the city, and I think it's been in the Argus Leader, that could use some improvement, you know what I mean? So how big is too big? And Memphis, Tennessee, what Joe Batchelor brought up was now they're going through the process of de-annexation on 7 different pieces. So my recommendation is we need a cost-benefit analysis. Is it a good deal for the city, and is it a good deal for the people that are going to be brought into the city, you know? Because we don't want to end up with growing too big and then not being able to take care of, you know, what you have. So,
okay,
that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Susan Johnson. I'm in Split Rock Heights, and I just have a question on if a neighborhood comes in and opts for the private street option, are they then exempt from the ADA requirements? If they're a private street, they're not. So
for those of you that couldn't see that, we were looking at a head shake, a no response.
Okay, so if somebody in the neighborhood has a need, you still have to put sidewalks in, if it's a private street.
The private street is just that, for the street. And if your neighborhood is part of the city has to file, the municipality has to file the
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments?
I have a question. That's creating some confusion in my mind, and I know it's feeble mind, but we just showed these people a picture of a private street with no sidewalk and told them that that was an option. And the way I understood, now, correct me if I'm wrong, there are things that would trigger a sidewalk in that area. In other words, if a resident said, hey, I have a disability, I need a sidewalk and we're in the city, you'd have to put a sidewalk in. Is that correct?
Correct.
The sidewalk wouldn't have to be put in unless something triggered the event. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So, but if one of the other neighbors decided they wanted a sidewalk and they put a sidewalk in, then you wouldn't have connectivity anymore, would you? That would trigger the sidewalk for the whole place, is that correct?
Yeah, because you need to worry about connectivity.
Right.
But, yeah, and so basically, depending on the circumstances, that might trigger it and might need connectivity then throughout that development.
Right. So, but I guess I'm
But the private
going back the part we just agreed to, though, because I think that was a different answer than what they went away from the podium for. If they have the private streets currently and they're annexed in the city, that does not automatically trigger a sidewalk function. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
So just to be clear, the private street is just that for the street.
I don't particularly endorse the private street condos,
Right.
but I don't live in one of those kind of neighborhoods, so but I think they need clarification so they,
Right.
you know.
And so a private street is just for the street.
Right.
A municipality, though, is required to follow the ADA for any other part of their development.
In your opinion, if Split Rock Heights was annexed tomorrow, would they be required to put sidewalk in the day after tomorrow?
Well, without talking about any specific property, I can say
That's
that
one we see with a private street.
I can say that if development is annexed tomorrow and there's nothing that triggers a need for a sidewalk, there would not need to be a sidewalk in that development immediately.
And that trigger would be a public need demonstrated by someone in the public that in the area or trying to get in and out of
Or
the
if
area.
everything around that development has sidewalk and the only part that doesn't have sidewalk is that development, that would trigger it. But as is, for a number of developments, being annexed would not necessarily trigger the need for a sidewalk immediately.
In your opinion,
Yes.
6 months after it was annexed, would there be a sidewalk in Split Rock Heights? Yes or no?
I would like to expand on my opinion, decide
Can we
yes or
start
no.
with a yes or no?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with a no,
Okay,
unless there's a trigger.
okay. Give me
Because
5 typical triggers that would get them. I just want them to go away from here with a
Sure.
happy heart.
And I want them to go away with a happy heart, too. Because we truly do care about everybody that's part of our community, and that includes people with disabilities. But a trigger would be, let's say somebody in your community develops a disability that they haven't had before. They now need to have an accessible path to get somewhere within your community. That would trigger it. If there is a development that has a current road project beside it where they might be installing sidewalks, the connectivity then might trigger that. Okay. But generally, if there's nothing in the plans right now, the answer would be no.
Okay.
Because I don't want to stand up here and make a promise that a sidewalk would never have to be put in. But I can tell you, as it stands, there is nothing that would say immediately you have to put in a sidewalk if you're annexed into the city.
Okay, and I wasn't asked for a promise, your opinion, and I appreciate it. It's just clarity, the law and clarity aren't always synonymous.
Oh, I agree. And so I appreciate your questions and,
Right.
and the opportunity to
Thank
make
you
some
for helping,
clarification.
because you helped me out there.
Good, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Colleen.
You're welcome.
Are there parts of Old Orchard Heights that don't have sidewalks, correct?
Correct.
So basically, since 1978, there hasn't been a trigger to have those installed, is that correct?
I can see everyone wants to speak, but me, so please get up if you'd like to.
Yes, there are a number of, I'll just say, areas of town that do not have sidewalk, and Old Orchard is.
But if there was a trigger tomorrow, somebody, for whatever reason, there's a trigger tomorrow, they have to install them, correct?
We would have to look into it and take the necessary steps. And and we were just up there doing work 3, 4, 5 years ago, and we communicated the same thing, that at that time they did not need sidewalk because there hadn't been a trigger. So if there was a trigger.
But if there's a trigger tomorrow, they have to put it in.
Yes.
Okay.
Teresa Staley, City Council. This is a problematic situation here. I've been talking to these areas that have been came into the city with an agreement that they wouldn't have to put in sidewalks, streetlights. That was a written agreement that they had. So now I'm hearing that if there's a trigger, you're going to go back to these areas and say you're going to have to put sidewalks in. That's going to be problematic because these people are understanding that they are grandfathered in. So is that what we're saying here?
In fairness, a written agreement doesn't supersede federal law. Municipal, I mean, I've got a.
Well, okay, but I think they need to be aware that this is.
I do too, and that's what I'm talking about, clarity and what triggers are.
And I think that's part of this process that we're going through, Councilor
So
Staley.
this whole thing is going to be spilling onto those properties that have already been annexed into our city. We're talking about things that could affect them as well, moving forward. Well, I think they all need to be.
I don't deal with hypotheticals.
The reality of a trigger could affect Split Rock Heights or Prairie Meadows without them even being annexed. Am I right in there?
So
Yeah.
then
You're not exempt from that. If the ACLU comes and sues me tomorrow because we don't have sidewalk on 42nd Street and we got 3 people that need one, I can assure you that there'll ultimately be a sidewalk.
But we just had a planning a situation with all the diagrams, and I was talking with our transportation guy, and he said that if you're having a private street, you have a choice that you don't have to have sidewalks. That was one of the options. The second thing I'm wondering is, how do these smaller communities throughout South Dakota operate without having sidewalks? Are they all going to be facing federal? I mean, could something happen, spread like wildfire across our state, where all these communities are going to have to suddenly put in a system of sidewalks if there's a trigger?
But I understand what's been presented this evening. The same triggers could affect them as it could potentially affect us. And what you bring up here this evening could have actually taken place 6 months ago or 12 months ago in some of these areas before we even started this effort here. So that's really nothing new. And I think Mr. Davis stated it very well. What we do, we cannot supersede federal government laws and regulations.
Right. I think we need to make sure everybody understands what could be coming in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Staley. Oh, okay, let's go. One more. Welcome.
Hi, David Rezak from Split Rock Heights. And I just want to flesh out a little bit more this private street issue because I'm a little confused. Our streets right now are public streets. Our development's fully platted. The streets are dedicated to the public. The township maintains them, I believe. So are we saying that it might be an option for the streets to be vacated and converted back to private streets that then we maintain and pay for maintenance and cleaning? I'm just a little confused. It's being presented like...
And I'm not certain what your circumstances are. If the county maintains your streets, is that what you're saying?
I believe the township maintains them.
Township, we have the same thing. We have the
does.
same thing in Prairie Meadows. You pay the tax to the wheel tax goes to the township, and they're maintaining the streets. So if you weren't annexed,
my point is, right now they're public. They are public streets. They're not.
they are, but they aren't. If it's the same as Prairie Meadows, which I can't tell you that.
No, they're platted and dedicated to the public in the plat. Well,
you know what I mean. It's I guess what are they? I mean, he's not in the city. We don't even know what they are.
We'll have Mr. Cooper, the true
Mike can
expert,
tell
or
us.
Chad. Good question, David. Thank you.
So we have right-of-way that's dedicated to the public, but there has to be an entity that accepts that right-of-way in terms of maintenance responsibilities. So if a rural subdivision that has right-of-way currently maintained by a township and it's annexed into the city, they would have the option to create a private road system. And then they would form their association to maintain that road system.
Mike, so you're saying they would have to create a road district if they got annexed and it wasn't the township's responsibility, that the development would have to?
I'm saying they have that option.
Okay, if they didn't do it, who would do it then?
Then the city would take those over.
The city would do it, okay, all right.
The reason we're saying they have the option is, again, to help people understand that with options, it affects the cost impact.
Okay, well,
that's all we're trying to say.
Yeah, and that's great. I clarified it for me. You have the option if you're a development to, or even if you're annexed, you can continue to do your own roads or have your own road district and all that kind of stuff, and that would calculate into your assessment, or?
If that's a desire.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have those
Yeah.
choices. That's
So
a new
we'll-
one on me.
All right, thank
For-
you.
For the rural section roads. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we knew sidewalk was going to be a big deal tonight.
Sure.
And that's why we wanted to have Clean here but there's going to be more discussion about that going forward as well. And I would just comment that a lot of these annexation areas predated the ADA law.
Right.
And again, federal trumps local law. So yeah, we will work through some of those issues with those existing neighborhoods.
Right, thank you. Okay. Did we have anybody different that has not addressed the, okay, real quick, one last statement.
The question was, if we have a private road system, would the water and sewer system be public or private? And in the city limits, the utilities are public. So there's an easement that allow those utilities to be underneath that private roadway.
Right, okay. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Okay. Sir, do you have a quick question? Come forward, please. And if we may, we'll end with you. I had stated that I would be willing to extend it 15 minutes, and we're approaching that.
I'm David Terrell from
David?
Split Rock Heights. Yeah, our roads are public roads because the roads were dedicated back to the township when the developer platted the neighborhood. So the township took ownership of the streets. They clear them in exchange for our tax dollars. And they put an extra layer of asphalt on a few years ago, also from our tax dollars. So I just wanted to put that out there as a clarification. Secondly, the main reason I wanted to come up is just to say, I think in the voluntary annexation that developers do, their interest is turning, $20,000 an acre land into $150,000 an acre land. And with that amount of profitability, they can afford to pay for the nice streets and gutters and curb and all the expenses. But for rural residents, we don't have any profit potential from our properties. And so any expense that gets put on our properties through assessment is just out of pocket. And that makes it very difficult to put in the state-of-the-art city infrastructure, especially with large lots that we have. And so I think cost is the number one barrier. I don't think anyone wants 25% increase in annual taxes, but I think that's not as big of a barrier as the infrastructure costs. That, I think the city, this task force, I think, would help the city council greatly by putting some guidelines together on how that cost share would work in a consistent way. Because I think it's going to take a significant cost share from the city to make it affordable to the residents.
Okay, thank you, David.
David, you said it a lot better than I did.
Well, I would like to thank everybody for being here this evening. And I'd again like to extend my thanks to the members of the task force for taking time out of your personal schedules to be here as well. And just a reminder that our next meeting is Wednesday, June